Look at the map of the Middle East. It is a tapestry of lines drawn in the sand, of nations born from the ashes of empires. But right in the center, bridging the gap between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, lies a fortress of mountains and deserts. This is Iran. To the world, the very name conjures images of burning flags, uranium centrifuges spinning in secret underground bunkers, and the omnipresent chants of death to America. It is a nation that has spent the last half-century locked in a staring contest with the most powerful military force in human history. But to understand Iran, to truly grasp the beast that dictates the geopolitics of the 21st century, you have to strip away the headlines. You have to look past the clerics in their black turbans, past the rhetoric of the ayatollahs, and look deep into the soil. Because this soil is soaked in the blood of conquerors, the oil of kings, and the unyielding pride of an empire that refuses to die. This is not just a country, it is a civilization. 2.5 millennia ago, while much of the world was still grasping at the edges of the Bronze Age, the Persians built an empire that stretched from the sun-drenched coasts of Greece to the untamed rivers of India. Cyrus the Great didn't just conquer, he governed. He authored what many consider the world's first charter of human rights. He freed the slaves. He allowed freedom of religion. He built an empire not just on the edge of a sword, but on the foundation of tolerance. That ancient pride, that imperial DNA, is woven into the very fabric of the Iranian psyche. It is the ghost that haunts the halls of Tehran today. Every decision, every defiance, every missile launched into the night sky is driven by a singular, burning belief. Iran is not a pawn to be played on the chessboard of superpowers. Iran is the player. Yet how did a nation with such a profound legacy of enlightenment become the geopolitical powder keg of the modern world? How did the inheritors of Persepolis become isolated, sanctioned, and pushed to the absolute brink of all-out war with the United States and Israel? The answer is a labyrinth of betrayals, assassinations, foreign greed, and a relentless, unyielding thirst for survival. Buckle up, because the story of modern Iran is a masterclass in how empires are broken and how they rebuild themselves in the dark. For centuries, the Persian Empire slept, its borders shrinking, its power fading, ruled by a succession of shahs who treated the country as their personal bank account. But in 1908, the earth beneath the Zagros Mountains cracked open, and out bled something far more valuable than gold: oil. The discovery of oil in Iran was the catalyst that brought the modern world to its doorstep. And with the modern world came the vultures. The British arrived first. They established the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, what we know today as BP. For decades, the British pumped millions of barrels of Iranian oil to fuel their Royal Navy and build their empire, while paying the Iranian government pennies on the dollar. The Iranian people, living on top of an ocean of wealth, were starving in the dark. This exploitation bred a deep, simmering resentment. A resentment that finally found its voice in 1951 in the form of a brilliant, European-educated aristocrat named Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a Democrat, he was a nationalist, and he was completely uncompromising. When he was elected prime minister, he did the unthinkable. He stood before the Iranian parliament and declared that the oil of Iran belonged to the people of Iran. He nationalized the British-controlled oil industry. It was a moment of sheer, intoxicating triumph for the Iranian people. For the first time in modern history, they were masters of their own destiny. But in the corridors of power in London and Washington, Mossadegh's defiance was viewed not as patriotism, but as an existential threat. The Cold War was freezing the globe. The Soviet Union was right next door. The British panicked, and they turned to the United States for help. They whispered in the ears of the CIA, painting Mossadegh not as a nationalist, but as a communist sympathizer, waiting to hand the oil fields over to Moscow. What followed is the original sin of the Middle East. In August 1953, the CIA and the British MI6 orchestrated a covert operation codenamed Operation Ajax. It was a masterclass in sabotage. They bribed politicians, paid street thugs to stage violent riots, bought off military generals, and flooded Tehran with anti-Mossadegh propaganda. The fragile Iranian democracy was strangled in its crib. Mossadegh was arrested, tried for treason, and locked away. In his place, the US and Britain reinstalled the monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The message to the Iranian people was deafeningly clear. Your democracy is an illusion. Your sovereignty is conditional. And if you step out of line, the West will crush you. Remember 1953. Engrave it in your mind, because every anti-American chant you hear in Tehran today, every proxy war fought in the sands of the Middle East, traces its roots back to that single, fateful summer. The West didn't just steal a prime minister. They stole Iran's trust, and that trust has never been recovered. With Mossadegh gone, the Shah was given absolute, unchecked power, and for the next 25 years, backed by billions in American military aid, he transformed Iran. He wanted to drag his country kicking and screaming into the 20th century. He launched the White Revolution, a massive modernization program. Tehran began to look like Paris. Cinemas, bars, and discotheques opened. Women attended universities without the veil. To the outside world, Iran was a beacon of progress, an island of stability in a volatile region. But the Shah's vision was a glittering facade built on a foundation of brutal repression. To enforce his vision, the Shah relied on Savak, his secret police, trained by the CIA and the Mossad. Savak was a nightmare. If you spoke against the Shah, you disappeared in the middle of the night. Dissidents were tortured in the dungeons of Evin prison. The rapid westernization offended the deeply conservative, religious heartland of Iran. The wealth generated by oil flowed into the pockets of the elite, leaving the rural poor to rot. The country was a pressure cooker, the heat turned up to maximum, with all the valves welded shut. It was only a matter of time before it exploded. The spark came from an unlikely source, an elderly, austere cleric living in exile in Paris, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini didn't have an army. He didn't have millions of dollars. He had cassette tapes. His sermons calling for the overthrow of the corrupt US-backed Shah and the establishment of an Islamic State were smuggled into Iran and played in mosques across the country. By 1978, the streets of Iran were boiling. Millions marched. The Shah's troops opened fire, but the blood of the martyrs only fueled the fire. The people had lost their fear. In January 1979, realizing his grip was broken, the Shah fled into exile. Weeks later, Khomeini returned to Tehran. Millions lined the streets, weeping, cheering. It was one of the largest gatherings in human history. The 2,500-year-old Persian monarchy was dead. The Islamic Republic of Iran was born. But revolutions are hungry beasts, and this one was ravenous. In November 1979, fueled by rage that the United States had admitted the exiled Shah for medical treatment, a group of radical Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They blindfolded the diplomats, paraded them in front of the cameras, and held 52 Americans hostage. For 444 days, the world watched in stunned disbelief. The most powerful nation on earth was paralyzed by a group of students. The hostage crisis was a point of no return. It severed the diplomatic spine between Washington and Tehran. To the US, Iran became a rogue state, a state sponsor of terrorism. To Iran, the US became the Great Satan. The geopolitical map of the Middle East was rewritten overnight, but Iran's new rulers had no time to celebrate. Because while they were busy hunting down internal enemies, a storm was brewing right next door. A storm named Saddam Hussein. In September 1980, sensing vulnerability in the post-revolution chaos, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein launched a massive surprise invasion of Iran. He expected a quick victory. He expected the Iranian military, purged of the Shah's generals, to crumble in weeks. He was dead wrong. What followed was the longest conventional war of the 20th century. It was an absolute meat grinder. It looked less like modern warfare and more like the horrors of World War I. Stagnant trench lines, human wave attacks, Iranian teenagers wearing plastic keys to heaven around their necks, running through minefields to clear the way for tanks. And Saddam Hussein didn't fight fair. He unleashed chemical weapons, mustard gas, sarin, nerve agents, choking thousands of Iranian soldiers and civilians to death in the trenches. But here is the detail that the Iranian regime will never, ever let its people forget. During this 8-year slaughter, almost the entire world backed Iraq. The United States, the Soviet Union, European powers, and wealthy Arab states all poured money, intelligence, and weapons into Saddam's war machine. They were terrified that Khomeini's Islamic Revolution would spread across the region. They wanted Iran bled dry. When the war finally ended in a stalemate in 1988, over 500,000 lives had been lost. Iran was devastated, but internally the war forged a steel spine in the Islamic Republic. Out of the ashes of that conflict emerged an entity that would come to dominate the Middle East, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC. They learned a brutal lesson from the war. Iran stands alone. No one will come to their rescue. Conventional military strength is not enough against American-backed forces, so they adapted. If they couldn't win a conventional war, they would master the art of asymmetric warfare. Under the leadership of strategic masterminds like the late General Qasem Soleimani, Iran built what they called the axis of resistance. They stopped fighting wars on their own borders. Instead, they funded, trained, and armed proxy militias across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Iran created a ring of fire around its enemies. They don't need to send the Iranian army to fight Israel or the US. They can just pull a string in Beirut, Baghdad, or Sana'a, and the region erupts. This shadow network has made Iran an invisible superpower, projecting influence far beyond its borders. But to secure their ultimate survival, they needed an ultimate weapon. And that brings us to the nuclear shadow. For the last 2 decades, the world has held its breath over one word: uranium. Iran claims its nuclear program is entirely peaceful, meant for electricity and medical research. The CIA, the Mossad, and the international community believe otherwise. They see the spinning centrifuges deep inside the fortified mountain bunkers of Fordo and Natanz as a ticking time bomb, a slow, deliberate march toward a nuclear warhead. To stop them, the United States unleashed the most crippling economic sanctions in modern history. They froze Iranian assets, banned their oil from global markets, and cut them out of the international banking system. The Iranian currency collapsed. Inflation skyrocketed. The people suffered immensely, but the regime did not break. Instead, they doubled down, and they hold a trump card, a geographical lottery ticket that terrifies the global economy. Look at the map again. Look at the southern tip of Iran, the Strait of Hormuz. It is a narrow channel of water, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. But through this tiny bottleneck flows 20% of the world's petroleum liquid consumption, a third of the world's liquefied natural gas. It is the jugular vein of global capitalism, and Iran controls the northern shore. The Iranian military doctrine is terrifyingly simple. If we cannot export our oil, no one will. The IRGC has laced the coastline with anti-ship missiles, underwater drones, and thousands of heavily armed fast attack speedboats. In a conflict, Iran doesn't need to defeat the US Navy. They just need to sink a few massive oil tankers in the strait. If the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, global oil prices wouldn't just rise, they would explode. Markets would crash. Entire economies in Europe and Asia would grind to a halt within weeks. It is a mutually assured economic destruction. This is the Mexican standoff. The US has aircraft carriers. Iran has the chokepoint. Every time a US warship sails through Hormuz, Iranian drones buzz its tower. Every time sanctions bite too hard, a mysterious explosion damages a tanker in the Gulf. It is a deadly game of chicken, played with the world's economy hanging in the balance. Which brings us to today. The shadows are disappearing and the war is stepping into the light. For years, Iran and Israel have fought a ghost war. It was a war of espionage and sabotage. Israel's Mossad deployed the Stuxnet virus, the world's first digital weapon, to literally spin Iranian centrifuges to death. They carried out brazen daylight assassinations of top Iranian nuclear scientists right on the streets of Tehran. They relentlessly bombed Iranian weapons convoys in Syria. Iran retaliated through the shadows. Hamas and Hezbollah raining rockets onto Israeli cities. Cyber attacks on Israeli infrastructure. A perpetual bleeding wound on Israel's borders. But the rules of the game have violently changed. The shadow war has exploded into open ballistic conflict. Direct missile strikes from Iranian soil into Israel. Israeli fighter jets penetrating Iranian airspace. The assassination of Hamas leaders in Tehran and Hezbollah commanders in Beirut. We are no longer looking at proxy skirmishes. We are looking at two regional superpowers with their fingers hovering over the red button. And standing right behind Israel, with its formidable military machine, is the United States. Washington finds itself trapped in a paradox. They want to pivot to Asia, to deal with China, but the gravity of the Middle East, the black hole of Iran, keeps pulling them back. The US has drawn a red line. Iran will not be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. Iran has drawn its own. Any strike on its soil will ignite the entire region, from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. This is the powder keg, a nation with the pride of an ancient empire, the scars of a stolen democracy, the trauma of a brutal war, and the strategic leverage to hold the world's economy hostage. Will the Iranian regime, facing immense domestic unrest from a young population desperate for freedom, lash out to survive? Will Israel, feeling the existential squeeze of the Ring of Fire, decide to strike Iran's nuclear sites preemptively? Will the US be dragged into another devastating Middle Eastern quagmire? The chessboard is set. The pieces are armed. The Strait of Hormuz is waiting. And as the sun sets over the Zagros Mountains, casting long, dark shadows across the sands of the Middle East, one thing is absolutely certain. The next chapter of human history might very well be written in the skies over Tehran. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows.